Good afternoon. I am Jim Beitler. I'm the director of the Marion E. Wade Center, and I'd like to welcome those of you in the Bakke Auditorium and those of you who are watching online to our annual Homecoming Lecture, sponsored by the Muriel Fuller Endowment for the Imagination and the Arts. The Fuller Endowment at the Wade features the creative accomplishments of the 7 authors. Last night, if you were with us, we witnessed a moving account of the friendship between Warren Lewis and a missionary named Blanche Biggs. Today, we're going to hear a talk on the unlikely friendship of Lewis and Tolkien. Many of you here, or tuning in, have read Lewis's comments in The Four Loves about how new friendships blossom. It's the you too phenomenon. And fortunately, our speaker today is an expert on this topic, particularly when it comes to the Inklings. She's even coined a phrase, the algebra of friendship. Dr. Diana Pavlac Glyer is a professor in the Honors College at Azusa Pacific University in Southern California, where she teaches literature, history, theology, and philosophy in the Integrated Great Books program. She's also an award-winning writer whose research focuses on C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and the Inklings. Her book, The Company They Keep, offers an in-depth account of Lewis and Tolkien and their writing processes. And in her 2015 book, Bandersnatch, she explains what we can learn about creativity, productivity, and collaboration from their example. Please join me in welcoming Diana Glyer, whose talk today is From Enemies to Allies, the Unlikely Friendship of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for that generous introduction. Thank you for being here. Thank you for making time to be together in this way. I have to say, the energy and the happiness that I sense as you're connecting with old friends, it's really heartening to me to see and to hear. I'm just so very glad that you're here. So it's hard to believe, but when C.S. Lewis graduated from Oxford, he had a hard time finding a job. He graduated in 1922 with a degree in classical languages and literature. This program that he took, it's been described as the flagstone of Oxford's undergraduate program. As Alistair McGrath points out, students in the classics program were expected to engage with the literary, historical, and philosophical riches of the classical age, all in their original languages. This program is seen as more than the accumulation of information. It's considered a gateway to wisdom, a way of thinking about life's great questions. That's the program, and C.S. Lewis excelled at it. But even though he'd done really well in school, he still couldn't find a job. So he decided to go back and increase his chances of employment by taking another degree, this one in English literature. This program usually takes students 2 or 3 years to complete. C.S. Lewis completed it in 9 months. And then he went back on the job market, and still nothing. He did a little tutoring. He took a temporary job as a substitute teacher. And finally, in 1925, he was finally elected to a full-time position as a don at Magdalen College in Oxford. So Lewis was an absolute rookie in the lowest possible academic rank in his very first year, in his very first job, when he met J.R.R. Tolkien at a faculty meeting. Now, 1925 was Tolkien's first year on the faculty at Oxford, but Tolkien had already been teaching for 5 years at Leeds University, a school roughly 150 miles north of Oxford. And while he was there, Tolkien held the position of professor of English language. Now, as you know, the system in England is different from the system here. The position of professor scarce and significant. Even more, in Tolkien's case, this job, this position, professor of English language, it was brand new and had been created specifically for Tolkien in recognition of his established work as a scholar and a teacher. And then when Tolkien moved to Oxford, he occupied another senior post. He was professor of English language and also chair of Anglo-Saxon. So while Tolkien held one of the highest ranks at the whole university, Lewis, he was just a junior member and brand new to his position. So the first thing I like to emphasize when I talk about Lewis and Tolkien is how very different they were. I've already tried to paint a picture for you of some of those differences. They were different in age. Tolkien was 6 years older. In teaching experience, in scholarly achievement, and in academic rank. But these were not the only differences between the two men. There were also significant differences in their academic disciplines. Now, you know, when we talk about academic disciplines, we're not just talking about a body of facts or information. We're talking about the particular way that people, scholars in different disciplines, ask and answer questions. It's about the methodology. And as I mentioned, Lewis's training was in the history and philosophy of literature, and then he took a degree in English literature, trained as a literary scholar. And in fact, many of Lewis's greatest books I hope you have discovered, are works of literary scholarship. This includes The Allegory of Love, A Preface to Paradise Lost, English literature in the 16th century, and one of my favorite C.S. Lewis books. You must read this. It's a little book called An Experiment in Criticism, and it's all about reading. Tolkien, on the other hand, was a linguist by training and a philologist by inclination. In short, rather than being primarily devoted to literature, Tolkien loved language itself. One of his earliest experiences of being enthralled by words happened when he was just 7 years old. He wrote a short story about a green great dragon. When he showed the story to his mother, she said, "This is a wonderful story, but in English, grammatically speaking, we do not say a green great dragon. We say a great green dragon." And Tolkien was fascinated by the puzzle of this order of adjectives. This incident, when he was a very young boy, launched him into the serious study of linguistic principles, explaining all of these structures. So fueled by his passionate curiosity, by the age of 20, Tolkien had already mastered quite a number of languages, including Welsh, Anglo-Saxon, Spanish, Latin, French, Finnish, and German. Not only that, by the age of 20, he had already invented 4 languages of his own. Now, Tolkien continued to invent language for 60 years. And these are not just a handful of vocabulary words to sprinkle on top of his stories. Tolkien invented complete languages with grammatical structures, phonologies, regional dialects, and in some cases, unique and beautiful alphabets. Now, this is Tengwar. Some of you recognize it? I just found you Tolkien nerds. The word Tengwar just means letters, and as many of you know, this is the alphabet for a language Tolkien invented called Quenya, used by Tolkien's elves. And this is another of his invented alphabets. This is a runic alphabet called Cirth, developed by the elves originally, as you know, but in the Third Age of Middle-earth, in the age of the War of the Rings, Cirth is primarily used only by the dwarfs. Yeah, you knew that. Beauty in the study of language. Beauty in the alphabet letters themselves. beauty in the structure and the grammar of sentences, and beauty in the sound and shape of words. Language was Tolkien's passion. And as professor at Oxford, he declared that, quote, language is the real thing in the school, end quote. So he promoted an entire curriculum for undergraduate English majors based on the study of language itself. He believed that language study was the foundation of the humanities and therefore the foundation of a liberal arts education. Not only that, Tolkien's first professional publication wasn't The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. It was this. It was a linguistic study, a glossary of Middle English words entitled A Middle English Vocabulary. It was published in 1922. You also may know that Tolkien spent quite some time writing entries for the Oxford English Dictionary, an accomplishment he was really proud of. So we've looked at a number of academic and intellectual differences between Lewis and Tolkien, and I'd like to consider another difference between the two, and that was a difference in their journey of faith. In the spring of 1926, when they met, Lewis was not a Christian. In fact, he had just published a long narrative poem called Dimer, and in the poem, Lewis attacks Christianity, treating it as an illusion that must be overcome and destroyed. And in his first book, earlier than that, in Spirits in Bondage, he writes a number of poems that are angry and defiant and, frankly, painful to read, as in this excerpt from a poem called De Profundis, where Lewis writes, "Come, let us curse our master ere we die, for all our hopes in endless ruin lie. The good is dead. Let us curse God Most High. 4,000 years of toil and hope and thoughts, wherein men labored upward and still wrought new worlds and better, thou hast made as naught. We build this joyful city, strong and fair. Knowledge we sought, and gathered wisdom rare. And all this time you laughed upon our care." In stark contrast to Lewis, during the same period, Tolkien was a devout Catholic, most sincere in faith, and devoted to reverence, worship, and prayer. In fact, Tolkien had been a devoted Christian since childhood. He remained so all his life. These two differences between Tolkien and Lewis, differences in faith and differences in their academic background, they may seem minor to us, but to Lewis in particular, they were huge. This is what Lewis said about their friendship, quote, "My friendship with Tolkien marked the breakdown of two old prejudices. At my first coming into the world," remember he was raised in Northern Ireland, "at my first coming into the world, I had been warned never to trust a papist. And at my first coming into the English faculty at Oxford, I had been warned never trust a philologist." Tolkien was both. As years went by, Tolkien was to be instrumental in Lewis's conversion to the faith. But that's a story for another day. In addition to differences in academic training and religious experience, a third contrast I would emphasize between Lewis and Tolkien is that they were very different in terms of their temperament. C.S. Lewis was known for his robust sense of humor, his booming voice, and his hearty laugh. He was taller than Tolkien by nearly 3 inches and sort of solid, stocky. Here's a description of him from one of his Oxford colleagues, quoting now, "Lewis had rather solid, well-marked features, a clear, emphatic voice. Not only that, he dressed very informally. He always wore a tweed jacket and flannel trousers, which was, at the time, the uniform of the undergraduate population. So here was a teacher who dressed like a student, his old tweed coat, baggy flannel trousers, and old floppy hat are mentioned in most descriptions of Lewis's appearance. He was casual, stocky, emphatic, joyful, loud, boisterous, and expressive. Lewis loved life. He enjoyed people, and he had broad and eclectic tastes. Tolkien? Well, Tolkien was a different sort of person altogether. He was shorter than Lewis, 5 feet 8 inches tall, rather slight, thin, and underweight for most of his life. He was also always impeccably dressed, from his necktie down to his polished shoes. He nearly always wore a coat and tie, and he often wore a vest, sometimes corduroy, although he favored brocade or those covered with decorative embroidery. It's the hobbitness of him. One of Tolkien's students described his teacher this way: Tolkien came into the room lightly, gracefully. I always remember that. His academic gown flowing, his fair hair shining, and he read Beowulf out loud like no one else I have ever heard. Tolkien was a great teacher, delightful, courteous, and ever so kind. In contrast to Lewis, Tolkien was slender, serious, detailed, and precise. You see that in their work, right? He described himself as a man of narrow interests and limited sympathies. Robert Havard, a neighbor to the Tolkien family and a member of the Inklings, was friends with both of these men, both Lewis and Tolkien, and he describes them this way, quoting, "They were very different men. Lewis was a big, full-blown man, overbearing almost, both in the weight of his personality as well as his physical weight, while Tolkien was a slight figure, I'd say 3/4 the weight of Lewis. And Tolkien's remarks were always made by the way. His whole manner was elusive rather than direct, whereas Lewis came straight at you. These are superficialities, says Havard, but there was a great difference in mental makeup. As you might expect, given this catalog of stark differences, the first meeting between Lewis and Tolkien was not particularly promising. Now, Tolkien wasn't impressed. I looked everywhere, and I can't find a single place Tolkien mentions their first meeting. From Tolkien's point of view, meeting C.S. Lewis was a non-event. It didn't make a dent. On the other hand, Lewis has become somewhat notorious for his response to their first meeting. He wrote at the time that he found Tolkien to be, quote, "a pale, fluent chap, not too bad, but he needs a good smack." So these two were enemies from the start, and then it got worse. Lewis and Tolkien found themselves on opposite sides of a number of faculty concerns, faculty committees, not the great place to forge a friendship, right? And the differences between them had to do, based on their subjects, on differences about curriculum. How did things change? Bitter debates in public, bitter debates in faculty, initial, not an impressive connection between the two. How did things change? Well, Lewis joined up with a group founded by Tolkien called the Coalbiters. It was a club devoted to studying old Icelandic sagas, especially the Eddas in their original languages. Now, the importance of the Coalbiters really needs to be elevated. There's been not nearly enough scholarship on this. We have with us Andrew Lazo, who has done some phenomenal work on the group, the Coalbiters, and their importance as coming before the Inklings, but also the importance of their work to this friendship that we have. But we need more. So the Coalbiters was a club devoted to studying old Icelandic languages, right? Especially the Eddas in their originals. The first saga that Lewis and Tolkien and the Coalbiters worked on was the younger Edda of Snorri Sturluson. In the original, it looks something like this. Now, reading these ancient myths in Old Norse is not really my cup of tea. But Lewis loved these old stories, and the chance to study them, especially in the original, was a lifelong dream come true. So Lewis and Tolkien became friends because of the Coalbiters. Later in life, in The Four Loves, Lewis wrote that while lovers fix their gaze upon one another, the essence of friendship is two souls looking together in the same direction. In this case, Lewis and Tolkien were both looking to the north. As Colin Duryea puts it, both men were enchanted by a vast northern world with wide, pale skies, dragons, and courage against the darkness. Together, their gaze was fixed on the stories that both men had loved all their lives, and that was the forge of their friendship. This is the second thing I want to emphasize this morning, the second aspect to keep in mind when you think about Lewis and Tolkien. The first was they're very different in so many ways. And the second, they bridged that gap and forged a friendship by their devotion to a shared activity. They focused their attention on a common interest, studying the stories they loved. That's the second thing, and here's the third. The third turning point in this unlikely friendship. Lewis and Tolkien made a commitment to continue to meet together in person regularly. They were intentional. I love the way that Warren Lewis puts it in a letter that was quoted last night in our performance of The Major and the Missionary. Warren Lewis says there, if only there could be a bit more get-together, that is, time spent together in person, getting to know one another face to face, how different life might be. So here's how Lewis and Tolkien managed it. Here's how they bridged the gap, transforming from enemies to allies. When meetings of the Coalbiters came to an end, Lewis and Tolkien made a very simple decision. They decided to schedule time to get together and have a meal together once a week. It became their regular habit. Tolkien would drop by Lewis's rooms, and the two would chat, and then they'd cross over to the other side of High Street, and they would go to the Eastgate Hotel. There, they chatted about school politics. They talked about the books they were reading. And Lewis came to describe these Monday meetings as one of the most pleasant spots in his week. After meetings at the Eastgate had gone on for about a year, there came another shift or change in the story of this unlikely friendship. As they finished their lunch, Tolkien reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a manuscript he was working on, a poem called The Lay of Lathian. He asked Lewis if he wanted to read it. Lewis took it home and loved it. He responded with 2 notes to his friend. Lewis wrote a short note of appreciation, roughly about half a page, saying that it had been a long time since he had read anything that he had enjoyed as much. And then a second note that was 14 pages single-spaced with some suggestions for improvement. So here's the amazing thing. Of the 2 letters, which one did Tolkien prefer? The second, because he had finally found someone who took his work seriously enough to lavish close attention on every line. That was a turning point. Tolkien took the initiative and shared the poem. Lewis took the work seriously and responded in wonderful detail. And during their next Monday morning get-together, Lewis honored Tolkien by taking a big risk of his own. He shared some of his poetry and asked for feedback. December 1929, and January 1930. This exchange of poetry was the core that eventually developed and became the Inklings. As the group grew, substantial critique remained the hallmark of the Inklings. They were not vague and they were not gentle. Now, Michael Farrell is a sociologist and professor, and he's one of the world's leading experts in the study of creative collaboration. He's studied the inner workings of the Inklings, and he described their meetings this way. The tone is intellectually competitive. Show no quarter, take no prisoners. It is rough and playful. This is an Inklings meeting where they're sharing their drafts, right? Peppered with teasing and insults. Although they provide thoughtful feedback about ideas, the group meetings are not occasions for compassionate support and the sharing of personal concerns. Like many male groups, the exchanges of the Inklings had the undertone of competitive sport. Points were scored through intelligent debate, sarcasm, and humor, but not through destructive attacks on character. Even so, witty repartee and put-downs were very common. That's a contemporary scholar's take on what it would have been like to be at a meeting of the Inklings. Here's how Tolkien describes one Inklings meeting. He said, quote, "It was a most amusing and highly contentious evening on which, had an outsider eavesdropped, he would have thought it a meeting of fell enemies, hurling deadly insults before drawing their guns." The friendship of Tolkien and Lewis illustrates the power and importance of dyads. That is, pairs of creative individuals who are fundamentally different in temperament, in vision, in background training skills and interests, but who nonetheless make a commitment to spend time working together side by side. As a result, these dyads accomplish far more than either individual could on their own. It is common to hear people say that Lewis and Tolkien became friends in spite of their differences. I believe that they became a dynamic, creative force because of those differences. If you look beneath the surface and study the history of clubs, organizations, literary movements, and other kinds of collaborative circles, it's actually quite rare to see a group that forms around one dominant creative genius. Most of the time, collaborative circles or creative clusters, they're built in the transactional space between two individuals, between opposites. A pair of creative individuals called a dyad. Now, a dyad is a pair of individuals in this kind of dynamic partnership. It's often characterized by strong contrasts in approach and brutal honesty in the way that they deal with one another. Dyads are extremely common in creative fields like music, literature, film, and painting. They also appear in industry, technology, religion, research, and politics. One of the best known dyads ever, at least for my generation, are these guys, John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Although they often wrote independently, and many Beatles songs are primarily the work of one or the other, most of their songs are actually the work of both. Sometimes one would sketch an idea, create a song fragment, and then take it to the other, who would add a bridge, write the chorus, finish a section, or just change things around. This is what John Lennon said when he was describing their interaction, their creative process. He said, "We were writing eyeball to eyeball." And working in this way, together they wrote more than 180 songs. When John Lennon was interviewed about their collaborative process, he emphasized their differences. Quote, "Paul provided a lightness, an optimism, but I would always go for the sadness, the discord, the bluesy notes. Now, this is one of the best known and most successful collaborations in history. And much like Lewis and Tolkien, these opposites thrived. Think about other partnerships, other dyads, and the profound influence that they had. Whether it's the discovery of DNA, the early psychoanalytic circle, or even the Cubism movement in painting, at the core of that were two people quite different from one another who made a commitment to partner together and allow iron to sharpen iron. Or these guys. The Romantic movement, the Civil Rights movement, innovations in flight, and of course, law enforcement. Now, as I was working on this talk, a friend reminded me over lunch of the political strategy taken by Abraham Lincoln when he was assembling his cabinet. Lincoln went out of his way to appoint individuals with different convictions, with contrasting points of view, many individuals who were, in fact, downright hostile to one another, to unite a divided nation. Lincoln knew that he needed to tap into the power that comes from a variety of perspectives, personalities, and points of view. If you haven't read Doris Goodwin's marvelous book about that, please do. Her book is called A Team of Rivals. Now, I'm amazed at how many different realms of invention are marked by dyads or by teams of rivals. How much all of us owe to this pattern, the iPhone in your pocket, the right for women to vote, the airplane that I took all the way from California to get here. Each of these breakthroughs was sparked first by a powerful team, a dyad, and then picked up and deepened and developed by a larger creative circle. So many breakthroughs have resulted from this kind of dynamic pair. Partners with different strengths and with complementary points of view. And maybe now you're thinking of people in your own circle who are different from yourself, who bring something new and different in irritating ways, but who broaden your understanding of so many key concepts and so many key aspects of life. Some of these, admittedly, are rocky partnerships. Not all of them end well. But in the meantime, the rough magic of those friendships becomes the core, the seed, the grain of sand within the oyster that forms unbelievably beautiful pearls. That found organizations become responsible for new inventions, spearhead political reform, lead to medical breakthroughs, and make beautiful music. Now, I've been really interested to deepen my own understanding of the mechanism of collaboration. I want to understand why it works. We know from studying all of these groups that it does work, but why? I mean, common sense suggests that the members of a team need to embody different strengths, right? And that when members of a team are coming at it from different perspectives, the whole will be greater than the sum of its parts. So practically speaking, more perspectives, more gifts, more skills add up to more potential. And we know this also from a scriptural point of view. Listen to this passage from 1 Corinthians 12. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as He wanted them to be. As it is, there are many parts but one body, and the eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. And the head cannot say to the feet, I do not need you. beloved friends, we need each other. And we needed to gather for events like this. I've been thinking about Lewis and Tolkien and dyads, and it's so clear to me that we are created by God to connect with one another and to deliberately work to bring out the best in each other, to thrive as we spend time together. And I think that's why it's so significant that you're here today. Events such as this one matter. And I'm so grateful to Jim and to Marge, to Crystal and David Downing, to the Wade Center and Wheaton College, to the staff, and to the donors and volunteers who have worked so hard and made so many sacrifices to create a space and a time like this. Because it is not good for us to go it alone. I've come to believe that these kinds of gatherings are not only good for our creative work, but also for our souls and our spirits. In fact, I think that God has built this kind of connecting into our bodies. And here's what I mean. Back in the 1970s, there was a flurry of research that looked specifically at how infants develop in their mental and linguistic capacities. What they found, in brief, is that babies learn a great deal from their environment. But by far, their most significant intellectual gains were made as they interacted with their caregivers. While environmental factors expanded their understanding of the world, when they interacted with one person, face to face, and eye to eye, it actually accelerated the development of new neural pathways in their brain. Researchers found it made a measurable physical difference in the physiology of these babies. Isn't that amazing? But here's the surprising thing. Here's what the researchers did not expect. These changes did not only happen in the children's development. They measured changes in the brains of their caregivers. The caregivers developed new neural pathways as they interacted face to face. Their brains were also changed. Well, there's a great deal of work to be done to understand these processes. I can say with some confidence that God made us for community. He designed us for each other. And when we meet and work together, laugh together, worship together, listen together, and learn together, we are in the process right now in this room of living out an essential aspect of God's design. What is clear is that when we collaborate, we change. We change in measurable ways. It's fascinating stuff with tremendous implications for understanding the creative process. And with implications for understanding our lives, our calling, our families, our neighborhoods, our participation as citizens, the way we work, the way we worship, the way we grieve, and the way we celebrate. It's called the mimetic impulse. The researchers who closely examined the way that the human brain was designed to work identified two consistent ingredients that characterize successful breakthrough, successful small groups like Lewis, Tolkien, and the Inklings. Here's the first. It works best when the people involved are quite different from each other, especially in their knowledge base, in their skill set, but also in their temperament. That is, the basic way that they interact with knowledge itself. And the second is this. People need to hang out together. There needs to be unstructured time, quantity time. Rough, messy, just doing nothing in particular kind of time. making it a priority to set aside regular time to just be together face to face with nothing particular to do. It's one of the greatest gifts that we can offer to one another. Different people meeting faithfully in person to hang out, laugh, talk, and just be together. You get those two things going and you got magic. So here's what I want you to remember. Creative accomplishment is a messy process. It is not neat and it isn't simple. But often at the heart of it is the simplest and most basic thing in the whole wide world. People who are different in important ways, who make time, not find time, make time to meet regularly, faithfully, intentionally, in order to see how their differences might lead them to bring out the best in each other. Let me explain it this way. That's the lobby of the Eastgate Hotel. And that's where Tolkien and Lewis usually met for lunch on Mondays, before the start of the Inklings. That lobby is the heart of everything that the Inklings became. That lobby is at the foundation of the creation of The Lord of the Rings, the writing of Out of the Silent Planet, the Screwtape Letters, Mere Christianity, and the Chronicles of Narnia. Dozens of other world-changing books were sparked because they got together faithfully, regularly with one another. Week after week, they watched to see how iron might sharpen iron and drive them into new and unexpected directions. And from that friendship, from that core, the dynamic interaction, not from one person or one leader, no, but from the interaction itself, that transactional space between them, the larger group of writers gathered, a group we know as the Inklings. Robert Havard, a local physician. Charles Williams, an editor at Oxford University Press. Warren Hamilton Lewis, C.S. Lewis's brother. Adam Fox, a well-known poet. 19 men, different in personality and background, gathered together and became members of this influential work. So, here's the bottom line. Lewis and Tolkien did not become friends despite their differences. The Inklings did not become a successful writing group despite their differences. They were effective and productive because of those differences, those necessary and important and powerful differences. That's what made the whole thing so much more than the sum of its parts. And here's the big takeaway this afternoon. We need to change the way we think about the Inklings. We need to change the way we talk about their interaction. And perhaps we need to recognize that we need people in our lives who are fundamentally very different from ourselves, who counterbalance our limits, who challenge our ingrained tendencies, who correct our blind spots, and expand our point of view. I love what Jerry Root has to say about this. Have you heard him say this? He says it all the time. He says, the person you disagree with knows something you don't know. Find out what that is. When we do, we'll learn something about the wildness and expanse of the kingdom of God. We'll encounter a God who is not a tame lion and a world that is bigger and more beautiful than we can imagine. When he was asked to say a few words about his friend C.S. Lewis, Dr. Robert Havard said this: "Our differences laid the foundation of a friendship that lasted 30 years. The emphasis is clear. Havard does not say that similarities formed a foundation that allowed friendship to thrive in spite of their many differences. No, that's not what he said. He says the differences themselves were the foundation." So Tolkien got it right, I think, in The Lord of the Rings. The fellowship works together and is successful. Why? Because the members of the fellowship are so very different from one another. Different nationalities, cultures, shapes, sizes, temperaments, and abilities. Different parts that gather together to create a coherent whole. Not so different from the people here this afternoon, right here today. The people sitting around you. Like it says in 1 Corinthians, each part of the body is indispensable to the whole. You are indispensable. You're indispensable to the whole. You are such a beloved and significant part of what God is doing in this world. As Inklings work together, their differences in personality, perspective, and gifting stimulated fresh thought, encouraged creative risk, and inspired new directions. They went out of their way to spend time with one another and to listen and to learn from what others had to say. And I say that if we're to function as the whole body of Christ, if we long to be productive and fruitful in the work that we do, if we hope to continue to be creative, innovative, and impactful, we should be encouraged to think like the Inklings and do the same. Thank you.
So we have some time for questions, and I will stand in the middle, and I will pass you the mic for your questions. So are there any questions from our audience? While you're waiting to think up your question, let me say two things. There were two texts that were mentioned that I took note of. One was An Experiment in Criticism.
Yes.
Which is an amazing book. And just today, I was holding in my hands the manuscript written in Lewis's own hand because it's here in the Wade Center. And you can see his corrections.
Wow.
The other text that was mentioned today was by Snorri Sturluson, Prose Eddas. We have Lewis's copy of the Heimskringla, which has his underlinings in it, just recently acquired. And there are characters in it with names like Treebeard. All right, questions? I gave you time. Yes.
Thank you so much. You talked about the initiation of this friendship because of differences, and then you talked about its successful time period. Were there rocky places that didn't come up, and if that contributed to elevating or strengthening, or if those were places that had to become overcome and to regain that friendship that had sparked because of rather than in spite of differences?
Sure. Not only were there differences at the beginning and there were some tensions, there were tensions all the way along. But one thing that I think is really important for me to underscore is the myth that Lewis and Tolkien became, there was a cooling of their friendship, or that toward the end of their friendship they were no longer as close, is absolutely not true. So that's been perpetuated in a number of biographies. It's thoroughly wrong. We know, for example, that at the end of Lewis's life, Tolkien went to visit and sit by the bedside of Lewis faithfully and regularly, and to reminisce and connect together. So sure, there were ups and downs like there would be in our friendship, right? Like any friendship, especially people who are doing life together, who are engaged in the same kinds of work, right? You're going to see these tensions and these sparks. There were challenges because neither men drove a car. And there were challenges because as one or the other changed house or became busy with other projects, it sometimes, maybe you can relate, it sometimes is hard to make time, right? Just to get together. It's easy to minimize the importance of those regular face-to-face times. And there were some seasons where they weren't as able, it wasn't as convenient. They weren't necessarily on the same campus or in the same locale. And so it was more a sense of it's harder to get together, we're all really busy, there's other things going on, and they needed to redouble their efforts and reconnect. Good question, thank you.
Other questions?
Beside the first poem that they interacted with during their other writings, did they have interaction and critique and so forth?
Yeah, pretty much all of their work was read and critiqued in these regular Thursday Inklings meetings of the whole group. And the core activity in that was they would read it out loud, and then everyone would pounce with suggestions. I think those meetings were really important not only for the feedback that they got, but I also think that they're an example of the influence of anticipation. So I want you to picture Tolkien, first of all, who is a notorious procrastinator, looking at his watch and going, oh shoot, it's Wednesday. Tomorrow the guys are gonna ask for my next chapter, you know, and actually getting to the work instead of what he might rather be doing. So you have that kind of anticipation. But I also think that since these men met for about 17 years, once a week for about 17 years, reading and critiquing their stuff, they sort of learned what each other's biases were, and they wrote increasingly to avoid getting attacked by one another, right? And I think that's impossible to measure, right? I can measure and have measured substantial changes that were made in the manuscript based on comments that they made on each other's manuscripts. But I can't measure Warren Lewis sitting there working on his history and saying to himself, oh no, I can't say that because Charles Williams is going to jump all over me. I'd better say it this way, right? So I don't get in trouble with the guys. So I think that the influence of anticipation was also huge, but as a scholar, I can't prove that. That's my hunch.
Thank you for elucidating such a great topic. And as much as we love thinking about the Inklings as a group and thinking about the fellowship or the community of St. Anne's on the Hill or the children who get called in, and as much as it's great to spend an hour thinking about that, how can we go from here and do that for ourselves? Do you have any advice about how to do what the Inklings did?
I wrote a book about that.
Available right after this. And she'll sign it for you.
But if I, there we go. Bandersnatch is really about doing what the Inklings did. That's what that is about in a more of a creative writing kind of sense. But I do have one thing that I always tell my students that I think has been really, really helpful when I go to teach my class at Azusa Pacific University. The first thing I do during the first week is I write on the board an adaptation of a saying by St. Francis from the prayer that's attributed to him. And I write on the board, seek first to understand, then to be understood. And I think that a lot of it is that pause when someone says something and we think, that's outrageous, that's stupid, and I don't believe you. If we pause and instead seek first to understand. And so I've done some lectures there on YouTube. They're available on the topic of intellectual hospitality. And in those lectures, I give some guidelines in terms of the questions we can ask one another. So the first question is, can you clarify for me what you mean by that? Because a lot of times we're not arguing with what the other person actually thinks. We're arguing with what we think or assume they said. So can you clarify for me what you mean by that? Another one of the key questions from my point of view is, what is that based on? In other words, what's your source? As we're increasingly siloed in terms of our source of information, it gets really hard. So you heard news that I didn't hear. You heard a newscast that I wasn't tuned into. You saw a fact that I don't know. So I need to find out what you're basing it on, and maybe there's something I heard that you didn't, right? And so back in the olden days, we all watched the same guy on the news in the evening. We all were functioning from the same fundamental information or database. We're not like that anymore. We've each heard different things. So that's an important question. And the third question I like to encourage my students to ask is this one. What's at stake for you in that issue? Because a lot of times, if we understand what's at stake from the other person's point of view, it's easier for us at least to respect why they believe what they do. We may not agree with their conclusion. I think this idea of having to come to common ground is misguided. I do. But I think if we can try to understand one another, seek first to understand what that's based on or what they're building that assumption on, and then try to understand underneath that, if we have opportunity to engage, what's at stake? And once we do that, I think we can get in touch with a greater sense of tenderness toward one another, even in the midst of our disagreements.
This is a lame question, but I thought that picture you had up of them meeting at that hotel,
Yes.
I thought they met at the, was it the stork and the child? The bird and the baby. Well, it's not the bird and the baby, it's like eagle.
The Eagle and
I
Child
said
Pub.
stork. Eagle and child. I was just there too.
So the Inklings had, so this is before the Inklings got started. This is when it was just two guys getting together, okay, just Lewis and Tolkien. And then over time, Warney joined the group, and then Ari Havard joined the group, and the group started to grow. And they moved from the East Gate. They moved to Lewis's rooms at Magdalen College, and that's where the Inklings met on Thursday nights for critique. But they also met Tuesdays for lunch at the Eagle and Child Pub. Now, they didn't read their manuscripts or even really discuss their books at the Eagle and Child, because the Eagle and Child were more or less open meetings. There were women, there were students, there was the coming and going of all kinds of people. So you don't share your raw drafts of your manuscript in a setting like that, right? But they would talk and spark ideas and throw, and argue with one another there at the Eagle and Child Pub. But the readings of the Inklings were exclusively in Lewis's rooms at Magdalen College. So good. All right. One more question.
I know you focused on the differences between Lewis and Tolkien as a means of their friendship, but do you think that at least early on, their shared experience as officers during the First World War may have had some play in them coming together?
Yes. You're absolutely correct. Yeah, I think that there are a number of shared experiences. I think there may even be a list of them, which is kind of a different talk and a different direction. But absolutely, I think especially that larger historic cultural context and their war experience was a bond and an important one for them. Also, they're academics, and academics have a certain approach to the world. And so I think that was another one as well. But never underestimate the amount of difference between people from different disciplines within the academy. As one friend said, the fights in academe are so fierce because the stakes are so small.
And on that note, let us thank Diana Glyer. So what's going to happen next is you'll all be dismissed, but you are dismissed to go into our museum area where Diana will be. There are going to be books available for purchase. If you're interested in learning more about the practical ways that you might be able to form these groups, Bandersnatch is a great option. And if you're interested in looking at the scholarship around that, the company they keep is a fantastic option. And if you didn't get your chance to buy the Major and the Missionary from last night, we'll have copies of that too. So we'll see you later. Thank you for coming.